It gives me like the freedom, like when you learn like these combinations and then you try to mix them, it's insane.
He always has a very good sense of humor. He's very positive, he has lots of energy.
Pie ārzemešiem speciālistiem puišiem tādu to latīno tieši raksturojas, pamācot tādu draudzīgumu, arī radošumu, ko latviešu publikai reizēm trūkst šī radošuma un draudzīguma.
It's actually very, very great what he does in his lessons.
Esam dejojuši citur, bet šeit mums patīk labāk, jo viss ir savādāk, ir labāk, ir draudzīgāk, ar jokiem, ar piemēriem, un šeit patīk.
When he teaches that he's not prepared some special combination, but I feel this reality and connection with the dance floor because he do it really on time, in real time.
Every class is different almost, and because he pays attention to the details.
I like the positive energy and the flow of the classes. Avikk is representing different culture and temperament, so are the classes. With positive attitude, he goes into the details, but at the same time, he can be strict.
As being a national dancer, it helps me train my relaxation, to be calm, to not panic in situations I don't need to panic. So pretty much it has helped me to be a lot more relaxed.
When teaching, it's never the same, but it's something new. When dancing with him, it's always new. It's not dance is the same. He don't dance at the parties as well. The combinations he teaches.
That it's really versatile, it's joyful, it's free. It's without any constraints and any particular limitations of some styles or steps. It's just pure expression of yourself in the music, feeling the partner, and just really adapting to it. So each dance is really different, and each dance is like a different story in the music with specific partner.
And it's much more easier to learn that when you don't have to think about it after and more happens automatically. And I haven't seen that being taught anywhere else.
The freedom, how it's giving me more freedom.
Man patīk, ka man atļauj šeit mācīties puišu kārtību.
The technical aspects of the movement can be applied to any dancing style.
With Urban Sensual, you can dance bachata, kizomba, and different kind of music types, styles, even when there's no the beat of the bachata.
Really helped me improve my improvisation skills because I do ballroom dancing aside from the social dancing, and in this context I heavily rely on choreographies. And being able to learn improvisation in dancing together with Avikk really helped me to also feel more freedom in the ballroom dancing and in dancing in general.
Well, Avikk classes I think are very different from other studio classes.
I like Avikk, not only as a teacher, but also as a human being with all his extraordinary talents and personality. He understands me.
Palīdz brīvāk justies un arī pie jebkādas mūzikas.
Viņš ir tāds ļoti, man liekas, jūtīgs tāds. Man patīk jūtīgi cilvēki, jo viņš tāds radošs izskatās, dejisks, plastisks un draudzīgs ļoti. Ļoti draudzīgs, komunikablis. Un tas ir pats galvenais, lai cilvēks iesaistītu sociālajā dejā.
That I have to lead the dancing in a way that creates a very good experience for both partners.
Energy and the feeling of real improvisation.
Īpašāka pieeja, individuālās nodarbības ir labā līmenī un arī
He comes with his strong energy.
Because you not simply conduct your follower with your hands, but you learn how to do it with your whole body, and only
then you understand what is leading, following really mean.
Ārējais izskats, un man patīk tā plastika, kā viņš dod, un arī nepārāk sarežģīti tā, ka es kā deju treneris varu saprast, kā man mācīt arī savus klientus, kuri no nulles nāk bez priekšzināšanām pie manis.
He teaches so many things in so short time that the person can't actually feel how much he has learned in that small amount of time.
His creativity. He dances and you never know what's gonna happen. It's like performance all the time with him.
He is more than the best dance teacher in Riga, choreographer, actor, trainer, and so on. He's a good person with a wide heart and wise soul. Yes, and I'm proud. I know Avikk.